A little girl asked the Lycan king, "Why does your wolf bow only to her?" 3 years. That is how long Marin had been in my keep, before Lyra asked the question that broke everything open. I remember the night she arrived. One of 11 survivors pulled from the wreckage of the village of Thornfinn after my border patrols found the smoking timbers and the silence. 11 people, wrapped in salvage blankets, brought through the eastern gate in the deep of a November night. I had come down to the courtyard out of duty to see what could be offered. Warm quarters, work, a season's protection before they chose where to go. I looked them over the way a man looks at people he means to help and move along. I did not expect to keep any of them. I remember Reen. My wolf, 7 feet at the shoulder when he chose to be, a creature of gray iron and old thunder who had walked at my side for 40 years and bowed to no one living, stepped forward through the group of survivors and stopped. Not at the strongest of them, not at the elder who'd led them here. At a woman standing slightly apart from the others, her arms folded against the cold, a canvas satchel over one shoulder. She had her head down. She was looking at her boots. She did not notice my wolf at all. Reen bowed. Not a dip of the great head. A full, deliberate bow, his chest nearly to the cobblestones, his ears forward, his yellow eyes fixed on her like she was something he had waited a very long time to see. I stared at him. I had never seen him do that. "Strange," said my steward, Brecht, at my shoulder. "It is nothing," I said. "He smells the blood on her satchel. She is likely a healer." I told myself that for 3 years. Marin was a hedge healer. That much was true. Her satchel held the tools of it, dried yarrow, wound thread, a small bone-handled knife for lancing, 2 clay jars of salve that smelled of pine resin, and something sweet I could never name. She worked in the still room off the north corridor, keeping it better stocked than it had been in a decade. She went out with the patrol medics when they needed her and came back covered in mud without complaint. She set bones and cleaned wounds, and mixed tinctures for the coughs that swept through the lower keep every winter. The court did not know what to do with her. She was not a servant exactly. She had no formal rank. She was not a member of the pack. She carried no wolf, no bloodline I could trace. She was simply there, a quiet woman of somewhere past 30 who hummed to herself when she worked and asked for nothing beyond the still room, a pallet near the herb-drying frames, and leave to gather when the forest permitted. My court, the noble houses, the pack captains, the great ladies who attended my hall, saw her the way the eye skips over a piece of furniture, useful in her place, not worth addressing directly. I saw her the same way. I want to say I watched her from the beginning with a king's sharp attention. I did not. I registered her presence the way I registered the good repair of the torches, with mild satisfaction that a thing was functioning, and moved on. If Brecht told me Marin had saved one of the patrol wolves from a festering arrow wound, I said, "Good. See, she has what she needs." I did not go to the still room. I did not look for her in the hall. Only Reen looked for her. He found her every day. I know this now because I have gone back through memory with the ruthlessness a man applies to himself when he is appalled by his own blindness. The great wolf, who slept at the foot of my chair in the assembly hall and moved only when I did, would rise during the mid-morning and pad out through the north corridor, and I would hear, or half hear and dismiss, the soft sound of his return 10 minutes later. I thought he was going to the yard to drink. He was going to the still room to bow. Marin told me this later with the careful honesty she applied to everything. "He came every morning, my lord. I thought at first that he was hungry or had a hurt he wanted checked. But he was never hungry and there was never a hurt. He would come in and stand very still, and then he would lower his head like a bow, I suppose, and then he would go back to you. I did not want to trouble you with it. It seemed like a private thing. I had a wolf making a daily pilgrimage to my still room to bow to a woman, and the woman had not wanted to trouble me. 3 years. Lyra came to my keep in the second of those 3 years. She was 6 then, a child of the borderland pack of Keedholt, whose bloodline had been my ward since her parents died in the Eastern fever. She was a sharp-eyed, serious-faced little thing who had strong opinions about everything, and the unnerving habit of asking whatever question was in her head without checking first whether an adult wanted to hear it. She attached herself to Marin within a week. I don't know how it happened. I came down the north corridor one afternoon with Brecht, discussing the spring trade levies, and there was Lyra sitting on the still room work table with her legs swinging, watching Marin strip dried lavender from its stems, and talking, Lyra, who was habitually grave and said very little to most people, at considerable volume about a dream she'd had involving a silver bird. Marin was listening with the whole of her attention, the way she gave attention to everything, completely, without reservation, as if Lyra's silver bird was the most important piece of news she had received all week. I stopped in the doorway. Marin did not notice me. She was asking Lyra what color the sky had been in the dream, and whether the bird had sung, and what the singing had sounded like. Reen, who had followed me silently as always, stepped past me into the stillroom, and I watched him cross directly to Marin, not to Lyra, not to me, and lower his great head to the floor at her feet. Marin reached down without looking and laid her hand briefly on the top of his head, the way you would touch something familiar. "Good morning, Reen," she said, still talking to Lyra about the bird. My wolf's tail moved. I had not seen his tail move in 11 years, since the death of my father. "My lord," said Brecht at my shoulder. "The trade levies," I said, and turned back to the corridor and told myself that Reen was simply fond of her because she gave him good care. A wolf notices a healer's hands. It meant nothing extraordinary. The winter assembly met on the first deep frost night of the year. All the pack captains, the noble houses, the holders of border rights, gathered in the great hall for the formal rendering of the year's accounting and the pledge renewal that kept Verath's alliances whole. It was ceremony as much as governance. Torchlight on stone, the long table with its candles, Reen at my right side on his haunches, the hall filled with the sort of people who were very aware of their rank and its performance. Marin was not invited. She had no place in this gathering. She was, as far as the assembly was concerned, a keep servant of no account. But Lyra was there, because Lyra was my ward and was being raised to understand how governance worked. And Lyra sat at the far end of the table nearest the door, small and serious, with her chin barely above the table's edge and her dark eyes moving over everything with the focused attention of a child who is memorizing. The accounting ran long, as it always did. The candlelight had shortened, and the hour had grown late before I felt the thing that I had been telling myself for 3 years was nothing. Reen had been still at my right side for 2 hours. Then he moved. He did not go to the door. He did not go to the yard. He turned in the middle of the winter assembly and walked along the length of the great hall toward the far door, and I saw, through the gap where the door stood slightly open, that Marin was in the corridor. She had come, I learned later, to leave a flask of warming tonic for Lyra, who had been fighting a cough. She was not trying to attend. She was leaving the flask beside the door and going back to the stillroom. Reen reached the doorway and bowed. Full and deliberate, as he always did, but now in the entrance to the great hall in the torchlight, with every pack captain and noble house in Verath watching. The assembly went silent. I watched 30 people watch my wolf bow to a woman in a plain work dress who was holding a clay flask and trying to leave without disturbing anyone. I saw the moment Marin realized what had happened, the way she went very still, her eyes wide, the flask clutched to her chest. She did not know what to do. She looked at Reen, and then very briefly at me, and then back at Reen, and said quietly, "You really shouldn't do that where people can see." The hall stayed silent. And then Lyra's voice, clear and untroubled by the weight of the moment, the way only a child's voice can be. "Why does your wolf bow only to her?" The question sat in the hall like a stone dropped in still water. I could hear the rings of it expanding, in the exchanged looks of the pack captains, in the shifted posture of the noble houses, in the careful stillness of my steward Brecht, who had the face of a man who had been waiting for this question for some time and was relieved someone had finally asked it. I should have had an answer. I had been the one insisting for 3 years that there was an answer, that it was simple and mundane and nothing that required my attention. I had not in 3 years actually produced the answer. I had only held it at bay with the word nothing and moved on. "Why does your wolf bow only to her?" I looked at Marin. I mean that I truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time. Not with the peripheral half-attention I had given her for 3 years, the glance that registered her presence and moved past it. I looked at her the way my wolf had been looking at her every morning in the stillroom, with the whole weight of my attention, and I let myself see what was there. She stood in the doorway in a plain wool dress the color of undyed flax, her dark hair braided back from her face, a clay flask in her hands, and a look of mortified apology on her face for the disruption she had not meant to cause. She was trying to make herself smaller. She was trying to disappear from a room that was now looking at her, and the trying was quiet and practiced, the unconscious effort of someone who had made herself small for a very long time. Reen stood beside her with his head still lowered. I felt something break open in my chest, not gently. The way ice breaks in spring with a crack you feel in your teeth before you've consciously registered the sound. "My lord," said Brecht. I pushed back my chair and stood. "The assembly is recessed," I said. 1 hour. I went to her. I don't think I had ever walked the length of the great hall faster. The pack captains and noble houses parted, not because I asked them to, but because there was something in the way I moved that said very clearly that I was not circling around people tonight. I reached the doorway where Marin stood and stopped 2 feet from her. Up close she was. I don't know how to say it except plainly. She was entirely herself, not performing calm, not presenting dignity, simply standing there in her work dress with her clay flask and her braided hair, meeting my eyes with the same directness she brought to everything, asking nothing from me and braced for whatever was about to happen. "Marin," I said. Her name had never sounded like anything in particular to me before. It sounded like something now. "Come with me." She looked at the flask. "I was only leaving this for Lyra. She has a cough." "Brecht," I said. Brecht appeared at my shoulder immediately, took the flask with the competence of a man who anticipated every situation, and vanished. Marin looked at the space where the flask had been, then back at me. "All right," she said quietly and came. I took her to the hall's anteroom, a small stone chamber off the great hall used for private consultation, warm with a single brazier, empty now. Reen followed and settled at the door. I stood across from Marin in that small, warm space and looked at her in the brazier light and tried to find the place to start. "How long have you known," I said, "that my wolf bows to you?" "Since the first morning after I arrived," she said. "He came into the still room while I was taking inventory. I thought something was wrong with him. I checked him over, he let me, which I found surprising. I'd heard he doesn't allow." She stopped. "He was entirely well, and then he bowed very deliberately and went back to you." A pause. "I thought perhaps it was a wolf custom I didn't know." "It is not a custom," I said. "Reen bows to no living person." She absorbed this. "I see. He has done it every morning." "Yes," her hands were folded in front of her. She was not fidgeting. "I ought to have told you. I wasn't sure it was important." "Not important? 3 years of my wolf making a daily act of reverence to a woman in my keep, and she hadn't been sure it was important." I wanted to sit down. "I need to look at something," I said, "if you will allow it." Her eyes moved to mine, questioning. "Your collarbone," I said. "The left side, Brecht tells me." I stopped. Brecht had not told me. I had not asked Brecht. What I was about to say was that something had been pulling at the edge of my attention for 3 years. In the moments I let my guard down, a warm pressure below my left collarbone like a hand pressed over a wound. I had attributed it to old injury. I had not let myself look at it. "I have a reason for asking," I said. "I will explain after." She was still for a moment. Then she reached up and drew the neckline of her dress to the side, bearing the left side of her collarbone. I crossed the room. In the brazier light it was faint, a mark the color of moonlight on water, a crescent shape with a smaller ring at its center, sitting just below the bone. The kind of thing that could be mistaken for a scar or a birthmark or a trick of the light. I had been told, a very long time ago by the woman who had tutored me in the old bond lore, that the moon mark rarely showed itself clearly before the bond was acknowledged. That it waited, patient as everything the moon governed, for the moment of recognition. I touched it with 2 fingers. The world did not move, or the world moved all at once, I am not sure which. What I know is that the warm pressure I had been calling old injury for 3 years expanded outward from my chest like a seal breaking, like water through a breached dam, and Marin made a small sound, not of pain, of pure startlement, and her hand came up to cover mine against her collarbone and stayed there. We stood very still. Reen in the doorway lifted his head and made a sound I had not heard him make, a low, long note, not a howl, something older and more deliberate. The sound a wolf makes when a thing long awaited has finally come to pass. "I don't know what that is," Marin said. Her voice was steady, but her hand over mine was pressing down as if she needed the contact to stay in place. "I do," I said. "I should have known 3 years ago. I am sorry that I didn't." Her eyes found mine. "You didn't know I was here." "I should have looked." A silence, the brazier popped. "What is it?" she asked. "The moon mark," I said. The fated bond, you are— My voice did not shake because I am a Lycan king and kings do not allow their voices to shake, but it was close. You are my fated mate, Marin. You have been since the night you walked through my gate. Reen has known it every morning for 3 years. I have been overriding what he was trying to tell me. She looked at the mark under our hands. I didn't know I had it, she said finally. The mark waits for acknowledgement, I said. The bond lore says it shows itself when both parties are ready. I was apparently the last to be ready. The ghost of something moved across her face, not quite a smile, not quite a wince. I've been told I'm easy to overlook, she said. I felt that land somewhere deep and specific. I know, I said. That is the second thing I owe you an apology for. We stayed in the anteroom for a long time. I am not going to pretend it was brief or simple. Nothing about Marin was brief or simple once I finally allowed myself to see her properly. She was precise and direct, and had a great deal of considered thought accumulated about things she had never been asked, because no one had thought to ask her. She had come from a small village in the upland country, the third daughter of a hedgeman and his wife, and had learned her healing work from a traveling herbalist who had passed through when she was 12. She had been on her own since the fever took her village, the village before Thornfinn, which made Thornfinn the second loss. She had survived both with the same composure she brought to everything, because, as she explained, composure was the only option available to someone with no pack and no protection. She had not known what Reen's bowing meant. She had wondered in the privacy of her own thoughts, but she had learned a long time ago not to build on things that seemed too large for her station. What does this mean? She said. For the bond. You understand I need to know what you intend. I don't accept anything by default. I looked at her for a long moment. She was watching me steadily, arms folded, waiting. She had, I thought, the exact quality of attention that I had always wished more people brought to conversations with me. The kind that actually listens, that waits for the real answer rather than the expected one. It means, I said carefully, that I would like to ask whether you are willing to be claimed as my Luna, not by force of the bond. Because the bond makes it possible, and I am asking whether you want it. Silence. I have been in your keep for 3 years, she said, and you have not spoken 10 full sentences to me in all that time. I know. I need to know that what you are asking is real, not just the bond pressing on you. The bond, I said, has been pressing on me for 3 years. I overrode it for 3 years because I was being a fool about what Reen was trying to tell me. What I am asking now is what I should have asked 3 years ago, which means it is very much real, and it is very late, and I would be grateful if you did not make me wait another 3 years to know the answer. She looked at me for a long time. Your wolf bows to me, she said, as if she was still turning this over. He does. And that's not a custom. No. He is the most frightening creature I have ever seen. Yes. And yet I have never been frightened of him. No, I said, you have never been frightened of him. She unfolded her arms. It was a small thing, but I had learned in the last hour that Marin's small things were large. All right, she said, ask properly then. We went back to the great hall. The assembly had not dispersed. I had expected they might. Pack captains and noble houses are not known for their patience during recesses, and an hour in a cold hall while their king went to speak privately with a keep servant was not the expected shape of a winter assembly. But they had stayed. Brecht, I suspected, had spoken to them in my absence with the particular tone he used, when he wanted people to understand that leaving would be inadvisable. Marin walked beside me, not behind me, beside me. I had asked her to. She walked the way she did everything, without performance, without apology, her chin level, her hands at her sides. Reen was already in the hall. I had heard him slip past us while we were talking. He was standing at the head of the long table in the full torchlight, and when Marin came through the great doorway he bowed again, and this time the entire assembly saw it without confusion about whether they had imagined it. 30 people watched my great wolf bow. The silence was total. I looked at the assembly, the pack captains with their formal bearing, the noble houses who had not spoken directly to Marin in 3 years, the holders of border rights who had nodded at her occasionally in the corridor and not thought of her since. And I let the silence extend long enough for them to understand what they were looking at. Then I reached out and took Marin's hand. She did not flinch. She let her fingers close around mine, and I felt the mark at her collarbone pulse warmly. I could feel it now without touching it, a steady warmth like a lamp in a room you've been trying to find in the dark. 3 years ago, I said to the assembly, a woman came through my eastern gate as a survivor of Thornfinn, and my wolf bowed to her, and I called it nothing. It was not nothing. Reen has known what she was since the night she arrived, and he has been demonstrating it to anyone willing to look for 3 years. I was not willing to look. I am looking now. I turned to Maren. Maren of Thornfinn, I said, which was the formal bond declaration, the beginning of the claiming, the words the old bond law required. The moon has marked you and my wolf has chosen you, and I am asking before this assembly whether you will be my Luna. The hall was so quiet I could hear the candles. Maren looked up at me. In the torchlight, the moon mark was just barely visible at her collarbone, silver faint, and her eyes were the steadiest things in the room. Yes, she said. Reen lifted his head and made that sound again, the long, low note of ancient acknowledgement, and the bond between us expanded in my chest like the first true breath after a long time underwater. The assembly was still silent. I looked out at them, at the noble houses who had found her invisible, at the pack captains who had accepted the salves she made and not asked her name, at the great ladies who had looked through her in the corridor, and I did not need to say anything. The silence said everything that needed saying. They had had 3 years to see what Reen saw, and they had not looked. Now they were looking. At the far end of the table, Lyra sat very straight in her chair with her hands in her lap, and an expression of intense satisfaction on her small, serious face. The expression of a child who has asked the exactly correct question and received a better answer than she anticipated. I caught her eye. She gave me a single approving nod, the gravity of which would have been more appropriate on a much older person, and I was glad I was not a man who smiled easily in formal settings, because I very nearly smiled. Brecht later told me that the speed with which the noble houses rearranged their understanding of Maren's position was impressive even by the flexible standards of court. By the morning after the assembly, everyone who had not known her name knew it. By the second morning, everyone who had not addressed her directly was finding reasons to address her. By the end of the week, the pack captains who had accepted her wound work without comment were presenting themselves in the still room with what Maren described to me, with the careful neutrality she brought to everything, as a great deal of sudden interest in their health. How do you feel about it? I asked her. We were in the still room. I had come to find her there because I had spent 3 years not coming to find her there, and it seemed important to correct the pattern. She was at the work table with her yarrow bundles, doing the same work she had always done, and she had looked up without surprise when I appeared in the doorway, which told me she had already adjusted faster than I had to the idea that things were different now. It's interesting, she said, how visible a person becomes when a great wolf bows to her. I sat on the bench by the window. You were always visible, I was not looking. You were looking the way most people look, she said, which was not mercy exactly, but it was honest. I've been not looked at my whole life, my lord. I don't think you were particularly unusual. Aldrich, I said, you called me my lord twice this morning. She set down her yarrow, looked at me with those steady eyes. Aldrich, she said, trying it, and something in the way she said it, carefully, like a thing she was allowing herself, moved through me like warmth. Better, I said. Reen, who had come with me, and settled in the corner of the still room with the ease of a creature who had been doing exactly this every morning for 3 years, exhaled heavily through his nose, which was the closest he came to editorial comment. There is a thing that happens when a long-suppressed bond is finally acknowledged. The bond lord describes it in formal terms. The mark stabilizes, the connection becomes conscious, the mate pair can sense each other's general state, the broad weather of it, not the detail. What the lore doesn't describe, because lore tends toward the formal and the ceremonial, is the quality of ordinary things once the bond is open. I noticed Maren the way I had not let myself notice her. The way she moved through the keep, unhurried, purposeful, without the slight hunching that most people unconsciously performed in the presence of rank. The way the patrol wolves tracked toward her when she came through the yard, not the anxious press of animals wanting feeding, but the slow drift of creatures toward something they recognized as good. The way Lyra talked to her, or rather, the way Maren listened, which was the real thing. She gave her full attention the way some people give money freely and without keeping count, and Lyra, who had been a child accustomed to being managed rather than heard, had bloomed under it. I had had this in my keep for 3 years. I had kept my office in the East Tower and my council meetings in the inner hall, and had managed the governance of Verath with what I considered solid judgment. And all that time, the woman the bond had marked for me was 30 yards away in the still room, and my wolf was making daily pilgrimage to tell me so, and I had told myself it was nothing. I was not inclined to tell myself anything was nothing anymore. The formal claiming was set for the midwinter court, 6 weeks after the assembly. This was tradition. The pact needed a ceremony, the bond law required witnesses. The noble houses needed the occasion to rearrange their understanding in a public way that everyone could point to afterward. Marin accepted the timeline with equanimity and continued working in the still room, which was, I had come to understand, simply how Marin functioned. The world shifted, she adjusted, she went back to the Yarrow bundles. What changed was that I came to the still room. Every morning now. Not always with purpose, sometimes with documents that needed signing, which could have been signed anywhere, and sometimes with nothing more particular than the observation that I had been in the East Tower for 4 hours, and it was a good time to not be in the East Tower. Marin did not comment on the frequency. She simply made room at the work table and continued working, and we talked, or sometimes did not talk, which I found, to my surprise, equally good. She was one of very few people in whose silence I felt no pressure to perform. On the 3rd week, she said, without looking up from her work, "You know you don't have to find a reason." "Pardon?" "To come here," she glanced up. "You keep bringing documents, you don't need documents." I set down the document I was holding. "No," I said, "I suppose I don't." "The bond law," she said, returning to her yarrow, "says the mate pair are drawn to proximity. It's not unusual." "I'm aware of what the bond law says. I'm just noting that you could simply come without constructing a reason. The documents have been a bit elaborate." I looked at the document in my hand. It was an inventory of the Eastern grain stores from 2 months ago. I had signed it at the time. I had brought it again because, apparently, I had needed something to hold. "You are," I said, "very direct." "I've spent a long time being invisible," she said. "I find I prefer not to be now that the option is available." She looked up again, and the ghost of the almost smile was there, the same one she'd shown in the anteroom, warm and careful and a little wry. "You can come without the documents, Aldrich. I don't need you to have a reason." I set the document on the bench. "All right," I said. Reen in the corner moved his tail once slowly against the floor. The midwinter court came with snow, the heavy, silent kind that muffle the world and turn the keep into an island of warmth and torchlight against the white. The great hall was dressed as it was only twice a year. The hanging woven lengths of Verath's deep blue, the tables full laid, the candles lit in all the high iron rings at once so the ceiling glittered. Pack captains and noble houses and border holders filled the benches. Brecht had, characteristically, managed every detail with absolute precision and would never take credit for it. Lyra had, with equal characteristic intensity, inspected every element of Marin's dress. A deep, undyed linen in the color of winter cream, simple by the standard of court dressing and perfect for Marin for exactly that reason, and had made 2 small adjustments to the braiding of her hair with an air of solemn authority. "There," she had said, stepping back, "now you look like a Luna." "Do I?" Marin had looked at herself in the small silver-plate mirror in her still room. "I look like myself." "Yes," Lyra said, as if this should have been obvious. "That's what a Luna looks like." I had been in the doorway for this exchange, having come to collect them both. I did not say anything. I stood there with the warm pressure of the bond steady and full in my chest, and listened to my 7-year-old ward explain to my fated mate, in the patient tone of someone clarifying something obvious, that she had always been what she was, and looked away before either of them could see my face. The claiming was simple by formal bond standards. The law required the declaration, the witness of the pack, and the acknowledgement of the mark, nothing more elaborate than that. I had not wanted elaborate. Marin had not wanted elaborate. What we wanted, which we had discussed in the still room over 3 mornings with the Yarrow bundles between us, was honest. I stood at the head of the hall. Marin stood beside me. Reen stood at her other side. I looked out at the assembly, at every face that had not seen her for 3 years, and was now looking, carefully, and with the attention that is the specific product of understanding you have missed something you should not have missed. And I said what I had said in brief at the winter assembly, and now said in full. Reen saw her first. He has known since the night she came through the gate. I took 3 years to understand what he was trying to tell me. I will not take anything for granted again. I turned to Marin. The moon mark at her collarbone was no longer faint. In the candlelight of the great hall, with the bond fully open and the claiming said and witnessed, it was silver bright, visible, unmistakable, a crescent and a ring that had been waiting patiently to be seen. Marin of Thornfinn, I said, will you be Lunar of Verath? She had said yes in the anteroom, 6 weeks ago in the quiet. She said it again now in the great hall, in the full candlelight, with 30 witnesses and Reen at her side and Lyra somewhere in the front bench with her small hands pressed together and her dark eyes enormous. Yes, she said, I will. I took her hand. The bond rang through me. The word is not quite right, but it is the closest one, like a bell struck for the first time in a very long time, deep and warm and resonant, the sound of something settling into place. Marin's fingers tightened in mine, not in fear, in the simple acknowledgement of a thing she had decided, held, and was not letting go of. Reen lifted his head and made the sound. The great wolf's long, low note of recognition filled the hall, and when it faded the assembly was still. The particular stillness of people who have just been present for something the bond lore says is rare, and who know it. The noble houses bowed. The pack captains bowed. Even Brecht, who had the demeanor of a man who bowed to no occasion he had not already anticipated and planned for, inclined his head with something that, on a different man, would have been emotion. Later, much later, when the hall had cleared and the candles had burned low and the deep frost night pressed at the shuttered windows, I found her in the still room. She had come back, as I had begun to understand was simply how she was. Ceremony ended, she returned to the work. The yarrow bundles, the salve jars, the ordinary, necessary business of the keep. She was at the work table, not working exactly, just standing in the familiar space with her hands resting on the edge of it, looking at nothing in particular. Reen was at her feet. I stood in the doorway. She knew I was there. The bond made distance irrelevant in that way, a warmth and a direction, but she did not turn immediately. She was finishing whatever she was thinking, and I had learned to give her that. Then she looked over her shoulder at me. All right, I said. She turned to face me fully. The moon mark was still bright at her collarbone. It would fade to its usual moonlight-on-water subtlety in the days ahead. The bond lore said, now that the claiming was done, though it would always be there for those who knew to look. In the lamplight of the still room, with her braided hair coming slightly loose from the day, and the formal dress still on and Rena Gray Mountain at her feet, she looked entirely like herself. All right, she said. I crossed the still room. I stood close enough that the bond's warmth was a steady, specific thing between us, close enough to see the mark and the place where her collarbone curved and the careful steadiness of her eyes. 3 years, I said. 3 years, she agreed. I'm sorry for them. She considered this with the honest attention she gave everything. You were looking the way most people look, she said again, but this time she reached up and covered my hand where it had come to rest near the mark, the same way she had in the anteroom. Reen was more patient about it than you deserved. He was, I said. Her mouth curved, the full smile, not the almost smile. The one I had been given twice in the anteroom and was already learning was not lightly offered. Lucky for you, she said. He's a very good wolf. Reen at her feet moved his tail once, slowly, the way he did when something had at long last come right. I kept her hand in mine, and the lamplight held still, and the deep frost night was outside, and the still room smelled of pine resin and dried lavender and the something sweet I had never been able to name, and I thought, this is what it was all along. This ordinary, necessary, unhurried thing. She had been 30 yards away for 3 years, and I had managed the governance of Verath and called a bowing wolf nothing. And the whole time the answer was here, in the yarrow bundles, in the lamplight, in the hands of a woman who had learned to make herself small and was, now, choosing not to. I would spend the rest of my years making sure she never had to choose that again. Reen already knew it. He had always known.